So I would like to welcome everybody who is joining us today for this webinar as we get the controlled wood engagement process going for 2022. My name is Amy Clark Eagle. I am the Director of Science and Certification for the Forest Stewardship Council here in the United States. My responsibilities include many different technical and policy and standards elements of what FSC does, but in the context here, I'm responsible for ensuring or helping to ensure that how the FSC's controlled wood standard is implemented and how the U.S. National Risk Assessment is used are done in an accurate way and are done as consistently as possible. Today, I'm being assisted, by a couple of folks from the Consensus Building Institute. So I'm going to let you guys introduce yourself. Merrick, you want to take it?
Great. Thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. Merrick Hoban, Consensus Building Institute, based out of our Washington, D.C. office. I help groups like this have more effective conversations. And in 2018, I assisted FSC with its stakeholder engagement in that period of time. And then here back again with great excitement to help you all, not only on this webinar, but in the regional meetings that are to come. And we'll talk about a bit later in today's presentation. So going to keep us on track and make sure the conversation is one that's useful for everyone here and helps us move forward with this effort. And then I'm joined by Samanish as well. Samanish, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Samanish Samin. I'm a junior associate at the Consensus Building Institute, and I am here today to help with technical support and assistance. So if there's any questions you have about Zoom or any issues you're having, feel free to let me know and I can help you out with that.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm going to push forward here on the deck. Although it's decided it doesn't want to do that right now. Here we go. How about that? There we go.
All right, so before we go any further, I am going to read the FSC US's antitrust statement, since we have a number of potential competitors here on the webinar today. So as participants in this meeting, we need to be mindful of the constraints of antitrust laws. There shall be no discussions of agreements or concerted actions that may restrain competition. This prohibition includes the exchange of information concerning individual prices, rates, market practices, or any other competitive aspect of an individual company's operation. Each participant is obligated to speak up immediately for the purpose of preventing any discussion falling outside these bounds. So thank you for keeping this in mind and monitoring any potential exchange of information today. Thanks.
Terrific. Amy, if you can just keep going with our goals today.
Yeah, so I'm not going to do a point by point here, but the overall purpose of the webinar today is really to get this 2022 engagement process going. We are holding an informed consultative process as we did in 2018, with a focus on the control measures and mitigation options for the national risk assessment. Generally, the point of the webinar today is to begin to get a better understanding of priorities and highlights and things that will help us to better structure and format the in-person controlled wood regional meetings. And just as a really quick reminder, while this webinar will include a little bit of feedback, it's intended, just like I said, to get things going. It is not a replacement for participation or having a representative involved in the in-person controlled wood regional meetings or being aware of the outcomes of those meetings as a certificate holder.
Great. Thanks, Amy.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about the agenda, folks. It's quite brisk. It'll be a terrific set of interactions. This is our welcome, obviously, in our agenda. We're going to jump in quite quickly, Amy in the lead, describing the mitigation options that are on the table, the key issues, and an overview of those themes, which is going to help empower us into a quick polling exercise with you all on critical thematic issues. mitigation options, and so on. And so we'll do that right here on the screen. It'll be straightforward, no complex technology or additional links. The questions will come up on the screen. And based on the results, which you'll get in real time, so there's 80 plus of us now, I think, on this webinar, you're going to see what those themes are without attribution. So it's not a he said, she said, but rather where are the weight of viewpoints, at least in today's conversation, which will inform the nature, depth, and focus of conversation during the regional consultations that are coming up, which again we'll describe a bit later. We'll do that, and then we'll open up a space for conversation in the chat box. I'll talk about those in a moment, but at this point, probably everyone has done the chat box 6 ways from Sunday on these calls, right? But we want to have some conversation there. And in addition, believe it or not, even though there are 80 plus of us, if someone really wants to speak up, they'll be able to raise their hand and come into the conversation at that point. Also a space for chat box Q&A. So we really want to, if you have additional questions that need clarification, we'll ask you to put those in that box in a moment. And then finally, top lines and reminders for the meetings that we're going to have across the country coming up. So that's the story. One piece of counsel here from Samanish and I, getting it done on webinars without going crazy. One, let's use the tools. The chat box, the polling, and so on. If you have any issue with that, Samanish and I are here to help you figure that out. Please just text in the chat box, hey, wait a minute, help me find such and such, and we will help you make sure that happens. We have everybody on mute, but at some point that you may really want to make a comment, and that actually is a good thing to hear a few voices. So we'll see how that unfolds time-wise. All you got to do is raise your hand in the lower part of the bar here. You'll see a raise hand function. Again, if you have an issue, Samanish can help you find it. It's all about the themes that are coming up in conversation, not who said them, so not attribution, right? So we want to make sure we're naming those key issues, challenges, needs clearly. And also, if you need additional clarifications and information, we want to make sure you find that in the right place. So I want to take a moment here to invite you to use the chat box function just as a practice with what we call a connecting query. Just very quickly, in the chat box, if you wouldn't mind, a handful of you, if not everyone, just answer this quick, light query. U.S. forests 500 years in the past or 500 years forward, which would you prefer to travel to, where, and why? One line. Forwards or backwards, 500 years for the forest. You want to see them in the future, or you want to see what they were 500 years ago? If you could magically do so, thus the crystal ball in the corner of your slide there. Is there a particular forest you'd want to see, and why? Great. Xander, thanks so much. Travel to the chestnut forest of the Northeast right before the blight. The Appalachia, Adrian, that's fantastic. New England, the chestnuts, interesting. Past Northeast, yes. Lower Midwest, interesting. Everybody wants to see, I haven't seen anyone say the future yet. Really interesting, right? It's like with the reflection on probably the state of these forests in their pristine form, right?
I saw a move forward to the future to see.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Terrific. Did we see where that future place might have been? Here we go. Forward in the U.S. South. That's from Devin Corbett. Fantastic to see how we've managed our resources in the future. Ross, the Florida swamps before the invasive animals. Wow. Great. Super to get all these answers. The Muir Woods, right? The past, the redwoods from Michael, the Northwest forests. Wonderful. We are capturing this chat box, just so you know, for posterity. So I think this will be a fun little point to reference when we meet you all in the in-person meets, right? So thank you so much for entertaining us with just that quick reflection. It actually matters because we are invested as a group of colleagues, all of us, in the well-being of the U.S. forests and beyond. And obviously there are lessons from the past to take forward into the future. So thank you so much for that. We're going to push back in. Samanish, please grab those answers. I think they're lovely to have. going forward. Maybe we can even include them in the web page for the event going forward.
Cool.
So
So Merrick, I just noticed we do have one comment that came in through the Q&A box. So maybe a little clarification of how we're using the chat box versus the Q&A box differently.
yeah, just to flag that. So in conversation right now, you're commenting on the conversation we're having, the presentation you're hearing from Amy, the polls themselves, and commentary on what we're seeing as a result. That's for the chat box where you've just seen this question on forests. The Q&A is additional questions and answers you have about this overall process that you'd like clear answers to. And the answers to those questions, both the questions and the answers, will actually be lifted up and put onto the web page for this overall process. And we will show you that. If you haven't been there already, we're going to show you all of that. But we want to make sure everyone has a real sense of coherence and clarity about what this is about, how it's going to happen, what to expect, and what you'll get as a result in terms of insight and information. So that's what the Q&A is for, process clarity, all right? And the chat box right now is today's conversation explicitly, all right? Okay, so let me just push on here. Amy, I want to turn over the baton to you to give us a quick overview on where we've been, mitigation options, issues, and the like. So I'm going to push you to the first slide here.
Yep. So we have kind of three sections here, kind of how did we get to this point? Where have we been? What's happened thus far? What are we doing this year? And then looking forward. So we're going to start with that sort of the look towards the past a little bit. And just a really quick reminder, I know that a lot of you who are on this call are very familiar with the concept of controlled wood and what it is, why it's an important element and component of the FSC system. But basically, FSC recognizes that a certificate holder that wants to create an FSC certified product does not always have all of the materials that they need available to them as certified materials. And then this is where this concept of mixing comes in. FSC makes it possible to mix certified materials with non-certified materials, but there are some limitations on which and how those non-certified materials can be mixed in. A certificate holder, we're still on the top, Merrick, but that's okay. Certificate holder does need to determine what kind of risk is associated with the locations from which those non-certified materials are coming. And then if the risk is not low, they need to implement actions to mitigate the risk. And this is all structured within the controlled wood, FSC's controlled wood standard. And the US National Risk Assessment is the primary source of information about this risk designation, low risk versus specified risk, or something that's more than low risk. So if a certificate holder in the United States wants to do this kind of mixing, they need to look at the US National Risk Assessment, determine what kind of risk they're looking at. There's a couple of different types of risks they need to consider. Right now, we're talking mostly about the risk of origin. So what's the origin of those materials and the potential risk there? And then implement, if there is something that's more than a low risk, implement a control measure from the US National Risk Assessment. All of the control measures that are provided in the US National Risk Assessment include the expectation that the certificate holder will implement one or more of the mitigation options that are included in the controlled wood regional meeting reports, and those came out of the process that we went through in 2018. And it's those mitigation options that are really going to be their focus of this 2022 process as well. All right, Merrick, next slide. Okay, so back when we were working on the development of the National Risk Assessment, that's the NRA as referenced on this slide, it was recognized that while the FSC controlled wood standard really has an expectation that a certificate holder will be able to determine if a specific forest of origin and would be able to actually have an impact on the activities that are occurring within that forest. The FSC US board recognize that that really is not necessarily true for certificate holders in the United States. Because of the antitrust legislation that we have, which has restrictions on information that can be shared between competitors, which could include suppliers or customers, and because of the really complicated supply chains that we have, which create just a lot of steps necessary for information to be shared in order for some of our, or many of our certificate holders to have this kind of information. The board recognized that we needed to come up with a different approach. Okay, so next bit here, Merrick, if you would.
I'm working on it here. There we go.
Excellent. So instead of trying to focus in on individual forests, the approach was to actually step back and shift the scale and look at a landscape scale. And so within the National Risk Assessment, the areas of specified risks, so things that were identified as being not low or designated as not low risk, those were defined mostly at a much coarser scale, at a landscape scale. And then the idea was that if that mitigation that we talked about on the last slide, which is required, risk mitigation, were implemented by many, many certificate holders within the same landscape, it might be possible to reduce the risk of sourcing from undesirable places within these landscapes. So we're really looking at broader scale than what is the typical approach in the rest of the globe when it comes to controlled wood. But the next step was that in order to develop the kind of the menu of potential mitigation approaches or mitigation options, we really wanted to take a more collaborative process, not just say this is what they are, but get input on what are the different types of mitigation activities that could really be more effective when it comes to mitigating risk at the same time as being feasible for certificate holders to actually implement. And that's where the Controlled Wood Regional Meeting Report, or excuse me, regional meetings came into play. That was the location. We also had some engagement and interaction via a web page, set of web pages in 2018. But the real focus was engagement and interaction at these Controlled Wood regional meetings. And it was this collaborative process that came up with the suite of mitigation options that are available to certificate holders right now. In 2018, the board did commit to revisiting these mitigation options on a regular basis and to adapt them as needed. The National Risk Assessment and the mitigation options were approved in 2019. The board originally indicated that we'd be revisiting in 2021, I believe. But there's been a lot happening in the FSC US context. And so we came back to it here in 2022. All right. So looking at the process and what it is that we're doing now here in 2022. So we have had certificate holders who have been implementing mitigation activities as part of their control measures for controlling the non-certified materials since 2019. So we've had a lot of experience and learnings in that way. We've had the certification bodies who have been evaluating the different mitigation activities and the implementation of those control measures. And then we've also had partners who have worked with certificate holders on implementation and making sure that activities are happening and getting things going and on the ground. So we have a lot of that kind of information that's been things that have been happening that have provided or have created additional knowledge through experience. And adding on to that, FSC US has been working on implementing a framework for monitoring and evaluation, looking at what we can say about the effectiveness of the mitigation activities, and also what are the data saying in terms of changes that might be happening within those landscapes that we originally defined. as we move through this process this year, or over the next several months, the focus really is on the mitigation options. That was the key piece of what we worked on at the Controlled Wood Regional Meetings in 2018. However, as we are looking forward to revision of the U.S. National Risk Assessment in the not too distant future, we also recognize that this is an opportunity to bring in additional information that could inform the revision of the National Risk Assessment about, specified risk areas. Is there any new information that might suggest that they need to change, or where boundaries need to be adapted in some way? And also, as we're really interested in getting more input into potential information data sources that could inform the FSCUS's monitoring and evaluation work. Okay, so over the next couple of months, we're working through this process, starting with the webinar today, really, which is identifying kind of the higher priorities, highlighting things that we really want to make sure that we're digging into and understanding better as we move through the rest of the process. This will help to lead to us to how we structure and format and implement the in-person Controlled Wood regional meetings that are scheduled for December 6th, 13, and 14. So to help us really get into more in depth in the right places when we get to those meetings. And then throughout this time period, we'll be asking those of you maybe who cannot attend the in-person regional meetings, or who have other ideas that come up and you want to make sure that they're captured as part of this engagement process, you can do that through the web pages that we have developed for this 2022 process. As we reach the end of this process, that will be sharing information about what were the takeaways from the webinar, from the in-person meetings, from what we learned through the discussion forum at the web pages, and pulling that all together and then providing what this says to us and getting your reaction in terms of potential changes to the mitigation options moving forward. So with that, I think we're going to take a slight sidestep and go and make sure that everyone has at least a little bit of familiarity with the web pages.
Great. Can you see this right now? I put
No.
that right? Nope.
I cannot.
All right, one moment. Let me just make sure I can see if this... I'm going to stop the share here for 1 second.
Okay.
And pull up this separate page here.
All right, excellent.
There you go.
Thank you. So just very quickly on this, you can see the different groups of pages, categories across the top. On this home page, if you scroll down, this is the place where it kind of lays out the process, through the webinar and then the online engagement and the in-person meetings. And if you continue scrolling down, this is where you would go to register for the in-person meetings. And we're holding one in Portland, one in Asheville, North Carolina. Sorry, that was Portland, Oregon. I recognize that we have an East Coast and a West Coast, and probably others as well. And then the third meeting will be in Atlanta. The next category is the background. Yeah, and you can just hover there or highlight what's there. And this provides a little bit more detail around Controlled Wood, what happened in 2018, and the process for coming up with the initial set of mitigation options that were captured in those 2019 Controlled Wood regional meeting reports. The quick Q&A, if you click on that, Merrick, and we'll remind you about this later on. This is a place where you can drop questions. You can just submit a question, and that will come to the FSCUS staff. And then when we see those, we can then provide an answer. There's a handful of questions that have come in, and the answers you can find on this answers page right here. The final element is the discussion forum, and this is a place where we'd really like to kind of get the discussion going a little bit more and have different people providing input. If you go to the forum, Merrick, right now, I don't believe that we have any comments. If you wish to submit a comment, but do so anonymously, there is an opportunity. You can just send it to the email address is provided here in the web pages, and you can send it to us and we will add it to the discussion forum for you if you wish to be anonymous. And finally, as we get to the end, just some additional resources. If you want to find copies of the Controlled Wood Regional Meeting Reports or the National Risk Assessment, that's on the Important Documents page. So you've got a lot of different resources here just to kind of help inform and support the process.
Great. Let me put this down, Amy, here.
Mm-hmm.
All right. One moment. Share this back here.
Okay.
All right.
So anything you want to fill in the blanks here or gaps here, Merrick, in terms of
No, just to say that the website is so useful, and we really hope that you do take a moment to explore that and to use all of its utility there, because it'll really help you to engage in the conversations beyond this webinar, which of course we'll do the same. So why don't we just nudge forward here with the next piece?
All right, excellent. So FSC US took on the responsibility of completing a monitoring and evaluation process. Normally, if we were, following the FSC controlled wood standard verbatim, it would be the responsibility of each certificate holder to be able to demonstrate that the mitigation that they are implementing is effective. Because it would be impossible, since the whole concept here is to have multiple certificate holders and together having an impact on the ground. It really would not make much sense to ask an individual certificate holder to try and demonstrate the effectiveness of their actions alone. And so FSC US, with the support of FSC International, took on the responsibility of completing and implementing a monitoring and evaluation framework that would help us to determine whether or not there's change occurring within the specified risk areas, and then trying to link that back to, actions implemented by certificate holders. The framework that we came up with has 3 tiers. The top tier is really looking at each of the specified risk areas and asking similar questions about it. What's the context here? What occurs from an ecological perspective, and then also from kind of a certificate holder's perspective, what's occurring within each of the specified risk areas? What do we know about them, and describing that in a core scale kind of way. Secondly, we looked at considering all of the different certificate holders who are working to control wood and implement mitigation activities as a result, because they're sourcing from specified risk areas. Where, are there places where this is concentrated? Are there places where we are more likely to be able to see change if and when it occurs, and then identify what are the data that we're going to use to determine whether or not change has occurred. So that's the second level. At the third level, we wanted to look more specifically at the most common mitigation options and work with partners to figure out whether those appear to be having the intended impact or the intended outcomes that were desired when they were developed. So these are the 3 tiers of our framework. And we've learned a little bit in the limited time that we've been able to implement them. So you can flip to the next slide, Merrick. Mm-hmm. And initially, we just had 1 year in which we were pretty much establishing baselines, identifying what are the data, where are we as we get started, so we have something to compare to in the future. But as we did that, we learned a little bit about implementation of the mitigation options that was being done by certificate holders here in the US. By far and away, the most common mitigation options that were selected were from the theme of education and outreach. This was followed very closely, well, actually not that closely, but the next two were mitigation options within the procurement policy and conservation initiatives theme. Interestingly, we dug into the education and outreach efforts with a little bit more intent. We worked in partnership with the American Forest Foundation to get a better idea in certain specific pilot areas about how this was going. That effort, plus efforts from FSC US on its own through survey work and other activities, we found that it looked like those mitigation options were being implemented in a way that did meet the expectations as written and the intent of the education and outreach mitigation options. But we also found that there is an opportunity definitely open to us to work on ensuring that the education and outreach mitigation options are being implemented in a way that's more consistent and more consistently using high quality materials and high quality delivery. The last thing that we learned here is that the concentration of controlled wood sourcing that is affiliated with the National Risk Assessment and the controlling of wood using the National Risk Assessment is concentrated mostly in the Southeast and Appalachian regions. Yes, it's definitely occurring in other parts of the United States, but this is the place where we found that we had the greatest amount of sourcing and mitigation occurring. Okay. And then also through this process and the engagement and interaction and the work that we did, we were able to identify some forward-looking potential ways that we could possibly help to improve the system overall. FSC US, as we are able to increase our capacity and staffing, if we spent more time looking at and helping to develop partnerships for the implementation of the conservation initiative mitigation options, that would definitely help to make them more feasible and effective. And that we could really look at the mitigation options from a slightly different lens. And this might be something to be considered as we look at the shared criteria for mitigation options for the upcoming controlled wood regional meetings, and asking questions not just about feasibility and effectiveness as we did before, but also, is the way that this mitigation option written and framed, will it help us from the monitoring and evaluation perspective, or are there ways that we could tweak it to help improve the ability to monitor and evaluate effectiveness of mitigation activities? We will continue to be looking for additional data and information sources to help provide a greater understanding of what's happening and what exists within specified risk areas. These were areas defined by FSC US in the National Risk Assessment, and they don't necessarily align with other data and information that are available. And so that's made it interesting to look for information, and definitely we need to look for more. And also, as we learn through our initial effort to survey stakeholders, both certificate holders and others, that there is a lot that we can do to improve response rates and the understanding of what it is we're trying to do. So
terrific.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's, oh no, next bit for me.
So then what's coming soon here?
Right. So after the regional meetings have been completed in December, and if mitigation options and changes to mitigation options are identified, our next step will be to consult with FSC International on whether or not it makes sense to move forward with the changes immediately, or to implement those changes as part of revision of the national risk assessment. And that's gonna depend on a couple of different things. The FSC International looks at the mitigation options as part of the normative materials associated with our controlled wood system in the US. So the national risk assessment and those mitigation options are linked together. And therefore, before formally and officially revising the mitigation options, we need to make sure that we're have an understanding with FSC International on the process, the timeline, and the implications. But we will be transparent and keep you well informed about when we anticipate that any changes would occur, and you would have advanced knowledge of that. In terms of the revision of the national risk assessment itself, the period of validity for most normative documents in FSC is 5 years. And so ours technically should be completed, the revision process should be completed by March 2024. And so we were anticipating that we would be working on that revision during the year 2023. However, we have been asked to delay that revision process at least until the NRA framework. And this is a procedure document that defines how you go about making decisions about risk and what information and data and what questions and criteria should be used when assessing whether a particular geographic area is specified risk or low risk. That framework is in the process of being revised. And we have been asked to delay our revision process so that we would be using the updated NRA framework. We anticipate that the revision process for the NRA framework will last at least through 2023. And so revision of the US NRA will likely not be initiated at least until 2024. And that would probably take a year or more to complete our NRA revision process. However, there's one complicating factor, which is that the controlled wood standard is also being revised. That process is being initiated in 2023. As of right now, it's not clear what potential changes might occur in that standard. So we'll need to be in communication again with FSC International and then sharing information with all of you about how that might also affect the timing of our NRA revision process. All right.
Terrific. Amy, thank you so much. Timing is perfect. Actually, Sarah Crow just came into the chat with an important query in a moment where we actually have about 5 minutes or so you're perfectly on time to answer any general clarifications around, mitigation options and issues overview writ large. Sarah writes, what considerations would FSC International have about making that decision to move forward or wait? What factors would you raise around the trade-offs? Can you speak to that a bit, Amy?
I think that the question of whether to move forward immediately with changes to the mitigation options or wait until the NRA is revised would likely be weighed looking at what are the kinds of changes that are identified as potentially being valuable and important through this process with the controlled wood regional meetings. If the changes that are identified are minimal, nominal, would not have likely significant impact on the ground, then I think that we would be more apt in our conversation with FSC International to suggest, and I would expect that they would probably concur, that could wait until the revision of the NRA. However, if we find that there are some significant concerns, either in terms of the mitigation options really being difficult, infeasible, or not being implemented as intended because of certain kinds of difficulties, or if there could be important changes that would maintain feasible mitigation options but really up their effectiveness, I do think that that would be a scenario where we would engage with FSC International and work on trying to implement those changes a little more quickly.
Terrific. Thanks, Amy. Let me just invite others. Sarah, thanks so much for starting us off with a query or two. We have a few minutes. If there's other clarifications you have for Amy, you can throw those in the chat box. If you so wish to come off mute, you could raise your hand as well. If it's just faster, happy to unmute you if there's something there. Meanwhile, Daniel flags seems to be an underlying assumption that the mitigation format needs an update or updating. Given very incomplete effectiveness of the monitoring process, please explain why.
Yeah, so as I indicated, the one piece that came through as part of the monitoring and evaluation that FSC US has done is the potential for being able to help kind of narrow there's a very wide range of different ways that the education and outreach have been implemented. So across a broad spectrum of different quality of materials and delivery types. And it might be possible to narrow the kind of the broad range and really try and help to focus on education and outreach approaches that are going to be more effective. And this is the one place that we have learned through our monitoring and evaluation work that there might be a valuable, I don't want to say tweak, but a valuable consideration to changing mitigation options. I would say the other piece of this is if we learn through this process that there are mitigation options that have been totally and completely ineffective, that, you know, if certificate holders have tried to do them, they don't work, they're not worth keeping on the table, that's really important and valuable information. And that might be something that we would want to consider as well. So we don't have other certificate holders, perhaps, who are just coming into the system, trying to work with something that's already known to be ineffective. So I think it's really going to be focused on primarily what we learn through this process and through the regional meetings.
Great, thanks, Amy. We're going to take just a couple more here. We may not get to all the questions, but they will get lifted up into the Q&A section of the website and answered in full there as well. So there's just a handful here, and I'm going to see what you can do with these, Amy. So first of all, from Sarah again, how long do we think the control wood standard revision might last? Kyle, how is effectiveness being measured using spatial data? And there's a few more below as well that you can read, Amy, but let me give you those two first.
Okay, so in terms of how long might the NRA process last, I think, again, that's going to be affected by the outcome primarily of the NRA framework revision. My understanding is that the working group, the global working group that is focused on that, has proposed just a kind of a different way of documenting the decisions around risk and risk designations. And so depending on what comes out of that process, that could have a significant impact on whether we are just simply looking at, you know, what are any new data that may be available that could potentially affect the way that we previously framed and made decisions about risk in the U.S. National Risk Assessment, or possibly having to go through a different process for demonstrating the justification and rationale for the risk assessment or risk designations that were included in the National Risk Assessment. So I won't have any kind of specific idea around the duration of that revision process until we have a better understanding of what that revised NRA framework may look like. And in terms of the effectiveness being measured using spatial data, we established a baseline of many different data sources, including some qualitative and some quantitative. So including some spatial data in the mix there. I am not really in this webinar today going to dive into the details and the specifics of which and what and how. I think that could be a very long conversation and probably not the greatest added value for today.
Great. So, Amy, there's a few more pieces here, but what I want to do is I want to put those into later conversation if there's time today, and or into the web page itself, Q&A. I do want to flag though what those questions are so people understand they're being heard, they are being captured, and they will be addressed. So I don't want anyone to be concerned that your question sort of went off into the ether here. It is well captured. You'll get an answer very soon, right? So, the spatial data noted, Daniel. How do we improve effectiveness without first assessing that effectiveness? Well noted, Daniel. Second, that from Cami, if I'm saying your name correctly, what are we measuring and what are the changes we're supposed to be seeing? And then a question about whether or not there's any potential to connect remotely to the regional meetings. Kelly will talk about that at the very end here about the dynamics of that, and I can speak to that as well. All right, so all well noted. Thank you so much for those questions and engaging so terrifically. We want to actually ask a few queries now. So that's where we're heading into some very brief polling, about 4 or 5 lines of a query. I'm going to go over just broad brush what these questions are that are coming, and then Amy will take just a minute or so to introduce each query to contextualize it, give you a chance to answer, and then we may have, depending on your reactions, what the answers are, which you will see in real time, we may have some quick chat box discussion, or you can raise your hand, as I said before. There's many of us, but always invite a voice if useful. All right, so what are the queries? There are 5. There could be many more, believe me, right? But we're starting with these 5. So first of all, what merits primary discussion in these in-person meets? We're going to give you some options to think about those, and you're just, again, this is not a formalized vote, but to get a sense of where your leaning might be about what really merits engagement. 2, your impressions on the feasibility of the mitigation options. 3, the extent to which implementation of education and outreach options are achieving the intended result. Same frame around procurement policy and mitigation options. Again, are they achieving what they're intended to? And last but not least, the extent to which conservation initiatives and related mitigation options are achieving what they set out to. So Amy's going to say a little bit more about each of these and give us a chance to unpack them in the chat box if that makes sense. You ready, Amy?
Well, but first we have a
little test query. Yes.
Yeah.
All
so
right.
just to get everyone familiar with the polling tool, I have just launched a practice poll. Yes. And we are asking you to respond to, in your opinion, which of the following trees do you think best represents the characteristics of both strength and flexibility? We'll give you a minute here to think about that.
Great. Just to give you a warm up with the polling tool, and let me just flag that Daniel asked a query at the same time. Do we have a common understanding of what intended result is? So when you speak to the queries, if you could reflect that. Thanks.
Yep, Amy. I can. Okay, so we've got about 40% of those of you who are on the call today participating. It continues to climb. I'm going to give it another 20 seconds or so, and then we'll cut this off and we'll see where we are.
Brilliant.
All right. So we are at 75%. I'm going to end the poll. And here's what we see. Really interesting.
Right. What a spread.
What a spread, including a whole lot of it depends. I think my predecessor, Gary Dodge, may be on the call here today. So, but
Sarah says we cannot see it, so we can't see.
Oh no! You can't see it.
Hold on. No, it says now we can. It says now we can. So hold on. Whatever you did worked.
Okay, I think there was just a minor delay, but we have a dual tie between white pine and it depends. So But this was just to get a sense and a feeling of how this is going to win.
Okay, I just have to quote Angela: "White pine for the win. Facts, facts win." Okay, thanks, Angela. That's great.
Okay,
Okay,
if you can
so
take us to the first query.
you got it. All right, going across. Let me just push that away for a moment. Okay, polling query 1. All
Okay.
yours.
So we recognize that that we've identified the focus really here is on the mitigation options. We recognize that while FSC US does have this responsibility for the monitoring and evaluation and the effectiveness determinations around how things are going, we really are looking for input from those of you who've had the on the ground experience with these mitigation options. You may have a really good sense in terms of qualitative information and data that you can help us better understand from your perspective with your experience. What do you think? So do you think that there really needs to be a focus on concerns that you may have about feasibility of the mitigation options, or about effectiveness questions based on what you've seen? Have you had some brilliant ideas about additional mitigation options that maybe need to be brought into this conversation and included in the options that are available to certificate holders? Or are you really far more interested in kind of looking at the forward towards the revision of the national risk assessment, our ongoing FSUS's ongoing monitor and evaluation efforts, or the global revisions that are ongoing? So this is the first question that we would like to hear. And what are those things that you think merit the most, discussion at the in-person meetings? So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll, and I'm going to mute myself while I cough.
All right. While Amy recovers, we'll just give a moment to get the responses up. Thank you all so much for engaging and participating. Hoping the dynamics here are useful for you all, the conversation, the exchange, the polling. Again, this is not a formalized thing. It's a sense of getting where the weight of interest is. And Dakota says, I wish we could choose more than one option. You are right, Dakota. Maybe we should have done that top 3 topics, right? Well noted, but I think maybe in some follow-up commentary, if you were willing, Dakota, to flag that on the website Q&A and or additional comments about what your top 3 topics were, that actually would be helpful. So, and that goes for everyone too. Don't feel like you have to choose just one, so to speak, beyond this poll.
All right, we seem to be holding consistently at about 81% participating. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share results. Okay, so we'll give it a moment, and you can let me know when it pops up on your screens.
Okay.
So Samanish is helping us to understand in the chat box that any comments that come into the chat after are in response to this initial poll. It's just we're flagging where we are in the discussion today when we go back to the conversation. So.
And Amy, just to say, Daniel says here, just to start off the commentary here, answered something else because restructuring the control measure options should be on the table, but addressing problems with the specified risk designations is also important. And just to say here that Samanish has just sort of put the question here in the chat, because if you have additional commentary that you'd like to put here about why you answered as you did, and or where you see obviously the results, the interpretation of the results, why do you think we're leaning towards ever so slightly mitigation option effectiveness at 31%, and then maybe others perhaps a little bit more equally so, and 0, by the way, at ongoing revision of the global NRA framework template. If there are comments here just for a minute or two about what you're seeing in this preliminary results, please do put those in the comment and or raise your hand, and we'll hear what you have to say. give you a moment if there's any surprise there. Noted that it would have been better to have several top 2 or 3 topics. Feasibility and effectiveness are probably related. Thanks, Daniel. Noted. Great. Any other comments here? For example, if you wanted to rank your top 3 issues here, that might be interesting as well. If you want to quickly do that, I think that might be helpful. Even Dakota, if you could do that since you flagged it earlier, that would be terrific. And Amy, if you have any additional reflections, those are welcome as well.
No, I would be interested in learning either in the comments or perhaps if somebody wanted to put their hand up and speak. We have a lot of folks who flagged effectiveness. I know from our monitoring and evaluation work, that there's the one issue that was identified around education and outreach, but I'd be interested if there are other specific elements that where the effectiveness is deemed to be important. So if anybody wanted to provide either in by speaking or in the chat box a little bit more specificity there, that would be interesting.
Great. Thanks, Amy. We'll see what comes of that. Meanwhile, Dakota did rank their top 3 topics: mitigation effectiveness, specified risk areas, and inaccuracies in the NRA, and FSC US monitoring and eval efforts and outcomes. So thanks for that, Dakota. Helpful.
All right.
You saved yourself having to go to the website. So, all good. Okay, and there's just a few more comments here. I'm not sure if how we're doing on time. We might need to push here really quickly, but Holly flags, I think mitigation options, effectiveness would be a great topic because providing standardized template for ed and outreach would make this more effective. If individuals who are receiving different materials or facts could be problematic. Is there a way that these materials could be provided?
Okay. All right. And then some comments around conversion as well. Thanks, Sarah.
Terrific.
Interesting.
Why don't we hold it there just because of time considerations, and we can come back thematically as needed if there's time at the end.
All right. So if you could take us to polling query number 2.
Got it. Writing this down. Moving on. Boom. Okay.
So this is probably a little bit more oriented to those of you who are certificate holders. But when we were looking at potential mitigation options in 2018, the shared criteria really focused on both feasibility for certificate holders and effectiveness in achieving, the potential for achieving the intended outcome. And curious in terms of your experiences, either working with a certificate holder or other observations or your experiences as a certificate holder, given the mitigation options that are available within the Controlled Wood Regional Meeting reports, how would you rank or rate the feasibility of those mitigation options? And it might just be the ones with which you worked or just generally looking at them as a whole. We would be interested in learning your perspective here on how feasible. And for this poll, 5 is the most feasible, highly feasible, whereas 1 would be not at all, impossible to do, not feasible at all. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll and ask for your feedback here. Okay, I'm also looking at some of the other chat content.
Yeah, I was going to flag you back there later, but yes, the question about what effectiveness means, and then Robert also took a swing at answering that as well.
Yep. I'll come back to that. The next three polls are about effectiveness, and I think it's worth linking that to the controlled wood regional meeting reports. Okay.
Good. Sounds good.
All right. Feasibility on education and outreach out of 4. Okay, so it looks like the rank of 4, so not highly feasible, but still it looks like kind of on the more positive side of things. Sorry, you can't see that. I'm ending the poll and sharing the results. Apologies. Okay. So, and yes, thanks, Dan. Dan's observation is that if we still have several hundred certificate holders certified while using the mitigation options, then by definition, they must be feasible. So, and that is what, and generally that what folks are indicating is that they're more feasible than not. And in fact, I appreciate the fact that there were only, no one actually put in a 1. That's good to know. Just Merrick, I'm going to hand back to you in terms of any potential discussion here or input from the chat.
Well, again, if there's anything more to say here regarding the response around query 2, that is welcome. Just give you a moment to reflect again a bit more on how you evaluate the feasibility query here.
Yeah, and again, if anyone has something that they would like to say, please feel free to put your hand up. I would be curious for those whose experience suggested that there was very low feasibility. The folks, we had 3 individuals who indicated a 3, or 3 individuals who indicated a 2, excuse me.
Right.
Would be interested to hear if that was a particular mitigation option type or just generally that the entire construct was difficult and infeasible. That would be interesting.
Yep. And just a flag, Robert here flagging, are the mitigation options too feasible? So that's a different perspective. Interesting on that. And
Okay.
Bertrand, clear, no, they are not. Okay. So well noted. Amy, is there a wide spread of view about feasibility, generally speaking? I'm just curious if you have anything you would want to remark about that as you understand it in the field.
No, I don't think that there's anything particular there that I have heard or learned that I think would be of particular note at this point.
Okay. So. All right.
Okay.
Here's my sense. We go on to polling query 3 then. Yep.
All righty.
Okay, here we go. There's 3.
Okay, so in the controlled wood regional meeting reports, each of the mitigation options was linked to an intended outcome. And then when we're talking about effectiveness, that's really what we're focused on, is what were they intended to achieve and were those results achieved? So for the education and outreach, and many of them are similar, but through the education and outreach mitigation activities, the intention was to have an impact and change what's happening on the ground in terms of forest management activities within that specified risk landscape, and in a way that improves the maintenance of or the enhancement of the whatever that high conservation value was, or if it was related to conversion, and maintaining the forest or improving the forest itself. So that was having the education, outreach, mitigation activities, then having an on the ground impact in these ways: maintain, enhance high conservation value, or to maintain the forest instead of having them converted. And again, we recognize that you don't have a whole host of data. You have not been doing the monitoring and evaluation yourselves. FSC US is responsible for that. As I said before, we've really focused on establishing a baseline at this point, but we recognize you have experience and knowledge, and you've been out there and doing this work. And so we're looking for your input and thoughts on this front. And with that, I'm going to launch the poll. And so this is about education and outreach mitigation activities. and the effectiveness, in your opinion, based on your experiences and knowledge, with 5 being the most effective, or the highly effective, very effective, and 1 being not effective at all. Okay. Feasibility. Okay, so one of the comments that we got back on the question I asked with the previous poll, low feasibility is related to select mitigation options, not necessarily the group as a whole. Okay, that's good to know.
And Xander flagging, tough question here because it depends on the mitigation option, right?
Yeah,
it varies.
Yep. So we recognize this is a qualitative question, or we're asking for qualitative information and data here that's based on your experiences and your opinion as practitioners and experts who are somehow involved in the overall controlled wood system. We've generally hit a stable point, so I'm going to share the results. And it looks like kind of somewhere in the middle, with a slight possible skew to slightly more positive in terms of effectiveness, but really kind of right somewhere in the middle. So again, qualitative based on opinion, but considering that maybe this is a place where we could take or have a conversation. Oh, you can't see the results? Can you, Merrick?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Okay.
Time. I'm not sure if you can share them afresh.
Yeah, I don't have a way to refresh that, unfortunately.
Well, we can describe this, which is to say that essentially only 2 respondents felt that it would be essentially, yes, achieving a high level of the intended result. And then there were 28% at level 4 and 43% at level 3. 2 was 18% and 1 7%. So skewing towards effectiveness, but largely in the middle is the story here. So sorry about that, Carolina, Xander, and others. Xander says can see them now, so
okay.
It's working for some. Okay.
All right. But this does suggest that there may be a conversation here in terms of, are there ways that we can improve based on experience, improve the effectiveness of the education and outreach mitigation options and how they're framed, they're written, but without reducing the feasibility.
Amy, just to clarify, these polling results will be summarized and posted on the website as well, so people can see these in the future as well, correct?
Yep, we can do that for sure.
All right, brilliant.
All right. So
yeah.
Next one.
Here we go.
Okay. So we're moving on to number 4. And because the education and outreach, procurement policy, and conservation initiatives were the 3, by far the 3 that were most frequently selected by certificate holders, we just thought it would be helpful to have a similar question for each one of these. And again, it's based on the desired result, the intended outcome that is written in the controlled wood regional meeting reports associated with each mitigation option, and that the procurement policy mitigation options were intended to result in the avoidance of materials from sites where undesirable practices were happening, or in return having an impact on a particular forest of origin. So these were available to folks who actually knew exactly where they were getting their materials and where they might be able to either avoid those materials or have an impact on what's happening within that forest. So it was for more direct sourcing situations. And so the poll is very similar in terms of your perception, your opinions, in terms of effectiveness based on your experiences and your knowledge of around the implementation of procurement policies, of procurement policy mitigation options. Okay, we have a slightly lower level of participation. It looks like potentially in this, for this poll, that may be a reflection of the fact that this set of mitigation, the suite of mitigation options were implemented less frequently than the education and outreach ones. It looks like it's stabilizing a bit here, so I'm going to wait just a couple more seconds and then end the poll. All right, and share the results. All right, I'll give it a second this time.
And maybe, Amy, you can narrate some of these results too, just
some
a
of the
bit.
results. All right, so in my kind of overlook at the results here, very heavily centered on 3 and 4 as the by far predominant responses. So I would say that this set of responses skews far more positively than did the responses for the education and outreach, with no responses in that one category. So no one responding with the not effective at all.
Great. Let's see if we have any comments in the chat box on this. I know there was a little bit less of a response rate there for the reasons noted, Amy, but just to see if there's any comments about the results there. If not, we can nudge forward, but just to make sure we don't rush over any commentary. Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat box. I'm thinking maybe we hit this last query, Amy.
Okay, so then I will stop sharing this one, and if you would move us to 5. Yep, perfect. All right, so again, as the third of the suites of mitigation options that were most frequently selected by certificate holders, in the controlled regional meeting reports, the intended outcomes from the conservation initiative mitigation options were to create change on the ground, again, that would improve maintenance, enhancement, or restoration of particular high conservation values or the forests themselves, if it was a specified risk area focused on the risk of conversion, forest conversion. So similarly, we're looking at on the ground change, and we are asking all of you, based on your experiences, your knowledge, your opinion, your professional opinion, to how do you feel? What do you think about the effectiveness of this suite of mitigation options, those that are around conservation initiatives?
Great. And thanks, Samantha, for putting the queries in the chat. Very helpful.
Okay. Yeah, on any of these, I would be interested in hearing from folks if they had very strong opinions in terms of highly effective or not effective at all. Any kind of specifics on what's leading them to some of those kind of more extreme responses on any of these polls? Just thinking about helping us better understand how we can potentially, whether through changes to the mitigation options or otherwise, improve effectiveness of and better able to achieve the intended result. That would be very, very interesting.
While you're getting the additional results there, can you respond to Robert's query here? How frequently is the conservation initiative mitigation option employed, Amy? You have a sense of frequency?
Oh, I would have to dig back into, I don't have the monitoring evaluation results on top of mind. I think that is information that we could provide, I think through the web pages, either in the Q&A. There is one tab in the resources section of the website. There there are key findings and takeaways from our monitoring and evaluation efforts provided there. If those do not include any hard numbers as they relate to the frequency of selection, I can go back and look and see if I can add those to the website and get that information there to help answer that question. All right,
Great.
so we have, somewhat, excuse me, I would say a broader spread of responses on the conservation initiatives, still skewing to more positive. I think there's more 5s here than there were for any of the others polls that we asked.
Right.
So I think a broad range of responses, which I find interesting. It would, and maybe as part of the controlled wood regional meetings, we can get a little bit more insight into why the spread is so wide here. And
Right.
Again, what if there's anything that could be done to help tighten up the conservation initiative mitigation options to help push towards more effective while not having a negative impact on feasibility. I think that would be pretty helpful.
Great. And just looking to a couple queries here before we perhaps hear others. So, William, would funding a company planting trees count as a conservation initiative? Amy.
I think that would depend on the scenario. It would depend on what's the risk that's being addressed, and whether this is something that has been identified as a way to reduce risk for a particular high conservation value. In terms of reducing the risk of forest conversion, no, I don't think that would be considered, because it's, kind of the flip-flop. It's the opposite, whereas the focus of the mitigation options around forest conversion are really to reduce the loss of the existing forest in the first place, not kind of the replacement process.
Got it. How many conservation initiatives have been implemented by cert holders? Asks Dave.
So I, again, don't have the details, and that's information that I would need to go back and dig into the monitoring evaluation work that's been done. So we'll see what we can do about providing some more detail on that front.
All right, terrific. With that, are there any other quick reactions to the response around conservation initiative mitigation options? Just a last salvo there. I see I'm looking pretty quiet on the chat, so my thought is maybe we open it up a bit further across these themes then, Amy.
All right, sounds good.
All right, terrific. So, folks, thank you so much for that immediate sort of temperature check on these themes here and so on. And we just wanted to open up the conversation a bit more about what, if you were to look across these 5 queries right now, if there is a narrative or theme that you want to flag here, something that you think is telling a story just from this quick temperature check, that would be terrific. Also, if there are additional supplemental queries, Sarah has one here as well, hearing more about the conservation initiatives that were implemented, what they did, etc. Terrific. Let's hear a bit more about that. But anything else coming across as sort of the big story as you see what your colleagues are saying with respect to mitigation options and intended impact? Any other reactions to what you're seeing across these polling queries? What's the story? Give you a moment just to flag that in the chat and or to raise a voice if you wish. And of course, Amy, I'd ask you as well just to comment in just a moment if you're taking any sort of first reactions across the polling queries as a whole.
In terms of taking and recognizing that this is a qualitative data input and based on opinion, I'm still taking heart in the fact that for each one of the responses, whether it was focused on feasibility or on effectiveness, there were very few responses down in that bottom category, in the 1 category. And I think that is, at least in terms of first impressions, we haven't been
Mhm.
at this for very long.
Right.
There's limited kind of experience on which to base any kind of response. But
Yeah.
still, I take heart in in the low number of ones.
Yeah, some really important things to flag here in the chat, and I think I agree with what's been flagged here. I think sentimentally and specifically. So, first, Daniel flagging, we don't have enough information to make sensible conclusions. I think we'd all agree with that. This is guesswork at this point. Still, it's an interesting temperature check. Raw standards implementation equity for anyone to be able to implement mitigation options based on where they sit in the value chain as something important. Robert sees skepticism as to the efficacy of mitigation options overall. Jenna, I'll turn to you, Amy, to pick up any of these that you wish. Interested in how to address William Orega's question earlier about not feasibility to verify the impact of that measure to avoid sourcing. Does that mean he can't answer, or does that mean FSC US has to figure it out? Several more queries here. Let me just ask you, Amy, to jump in on the chat here. Which of these pieces might you want to pick up or react to?
Yeah, I think I agree with Dan entirely. This is just the beginning. The intention was for a long-term kind of overview and look. And one of the things that I am thinking about and in some way reacting to is that the FSCUS board did commit to coming back to these mitigation options, on a shorter timeline than the full revision of the national risk assessment. And it may be that one of the conclusions after the controlled wood regional meetings is that we just don't have enough information to legitimately make changes at this point, or perhaps we do. So I think that learning more about where we have some more solid kind of input and conclusions from folks regarding their experiences with implementation will be helpful. But I recognize that we do need to be well aware of that lack of time and lack of hard data on which to make decisions, and we need to be pretty cautious and careful about that.
Yeah. Thanks, Amy. Sarah flagging here again the importance of understanding the results of the monitoring and balancing that with mitigation, putting those efforts into context, right, within the spheres of control of certification holders. And I would just also flag William Arriaga, if I'm saying that correctly, an interesting flag of a perhaps a difficult challenge, and that is that some certificate holders are confused because they don't want to find HCV areas in their supply area, because then they will not be able to harvest from those areas. This should be made clear. Curious if any quick reactions to those, Amy.
Yeah, so I understand that anytime a high conservation value is identified, that has a significant impact, and so there would be a desire to not identify new, and I understand that, and I get that. The focus of what has been done through this process is to, many of the mitigation options are not focused on identifying new specific occurrences, but looking at what can be done to avoid negative impacts on the high conservation values that do exist. So I'm hopeful that kind of perception and reaction is not having a negative impact on the effectiveness of the mitigation options, but perhaps something that we need to look at. In terms of other comments that have come in, interested in learning more about the different regions and conservation initiatives from Michelle Mateo. And are there themes, common themes about what's been perceived as effective versus not effective? That could help us in terms of thinking about what we bring to the controlled wood regional meetings and how we learn about what's been happening on the ground and in the field. And that might be an important part of what to share there. from Robert Ruby's he perceived from the responses some skepticism in
Mm-hmm.
terms of the efficacy of the mitigation options.
Mm-hmm.
And to that, I saw a wide range of responses, and I would agree that there were some very different opinions that were shared through these polling exercises. And some skepticism, I think, was definitely represented there, some less so. And it would be great if we have an opportunity during the controlled wood regional meetings to kind of tease out, where is that skepticism focused on some aspect of the mitigation options in particular, or is it just generally, everything overall? And are there ways that we could fine tune the mitigation options to address some of the skepticism and reinforce the more positive aspects that have been perceived by certificate holders
Mm-hmm.
and
Amy,
others who have participated here.
mm-hmm. Terrific. Can you also say a bit more, Amy, about the impacts of mitigation for smaller HCVs, species that have smaller ranges? Any
Yeah,
insight into
so
that?
this is something that we did find through the monitoring and evaluation work.
Mm-hmm.
That moving forward, we may need to look at the monitoring and evaluation a little differently for the smaller specified risk areas that are more fine-tuned to a specific high conservation value. There was far less sourcing that was
Mm-hmm.
occurring
Mm-hmm.
associated with those. And so therefore the potential for being able to demonstrate impact, if you have fewer certificate holder sourcing, you have fewer potential mitigation activities occurring, which means there's less likely going to be an ability to link the outcomes from those mitigation activities to changes on the ground. Just, the overall framework was, many multiple activities that can together can create change. That kind of falls apart when you don't have a lot of sourcing coming from those smaller specified risk areas. So that's something that we may need to look at. That would have to be within the framework of the NRA revision, because that would require potentially revisiting control measures when it comes to those smaller specified risk areas, as opposed to having similar control measures for all of the different types of specified risk area. One of the other things that we will need to look at is that if there are small specified risk areas associated with a particular species, and there was no sourcing identified through our evaluation and monitoring and evaluation process, or no mitigation activities occurring, that may really be a loud and strong argument for revisiting whether or not it should be a specified risk area at all. So I think there is a need for looking at those a little more carefully.
Any reflections, Amy, on the striving for the balance between effectiveness and feasibility, round two, so to speak, of this effort? How you see that effort to find the balance between effectiveness and feasibility?
I think that that's just part of FSC. Everything that we do, there's a balancing, there's a push and a pull. I think that this approach that we've taken in the US, which is different from how the controlled wood system is being implemented in the rest of the world, we have to be able to demonstrate that there is some effectiveness of this, and that there is an impact in terms of mitigation of risk. Again, at the same time, as with so much of FSC, it's a voluntary system.
Yeah.
And if the options available to certificate holders are infeasible, then there won't be any participation in the system, and then that kind of has an impact on our ability as an organization to achieve our mission. So yeah.
Well noted. Where does the partnership stand between AFF and FSC?
Yeah, so we had a great partnership. We were able to work very closely with American Forest Foundation on those the pilot regions and really digging into what was happening there with education and outreach in some specific pilot areas. American Forest Foundation has gone through my understanding has gone through a pretty significant strategic planning effort and is really looking at their strategic focus moving forward. It has shifted somewhat away from a place where the work that they were doing with us really would add to their ability to achieve their strategic goals and objectives. So at this point, we don't have a next step on the partnership there, but an American Forest Foundation has been really open with the certificate holders with whom they've been working. But the methodology that they have been using is available, and if we are able to identify other partners that would be interested in implementing that methodology in other pilot areas, then this is something that we would like to look into and encourage and work on moving forward in 2023.
A lot of information about the early monitoring effort. A sense that maybe it hasn't been shared with the community. Is there a detailed summary, or will one be shared? What's the status on that?
Yeah, this is a limitation of where we are right now with FSC US and capacity. Justin Meyer, who was the lead on our monitoring and evaluation work, moved on to a new opportunity and one that would help him to achieve his professional goals and objectives and that was in February. And with all of what's happening right now in terms of changeover and our leadership change here with FSC US and our work on our strategic goals and objectives, we have not been able to fill that position yet. So one of Justin's next steps was to put together a public report of the results from our first year of monitoring and evaluation, and then make that more available. I have included the top line findings and takeaways in the web pages. So like I said before, that's included there. But yes, you're right, Dan. That is still hanging out there as a task that needs to be completed by FSCUS to make a more comprehensive report available to everyone. So I hear you, I understand, but at this moment, I have limitations on capacity and what I can get done. So
great. Well, thanks for being so forward on all these questions, Amy. Very, very helpful. And you're obviously in the hot seat for these queries, and that's very helpful that you've been so clear about what you know and where things stand. So just one last salvo here. If there's something else relative to the thematic points, granted we can't draw too many conclusions at all based on what data we have. That said, any other reflections on the thematic points coming across from the polling? If not, we'll push forward here to answer some final pieces. So we got a few more here. So Michelle, effectiveness based on sort of certification holders implementation might not move the needle very much when looking at it through a larger lens of the forest industry as a whole, certified versus non-certified entities. Reactions, Amy?
Yeah, actually, this is it's an interesting question, and it's one that I don't. So this brings me to a thought that I had recently in terms of mitigation options, and recognizing that one way that could potentially, in the broader framework, help to improve on the ground forest practices and reduce the risk of sourcing from a place where those undesirable practices are occurring. I mean, there's an argument to be made for increasing certification and areas of certification within the specified risk areas. Would that be something to consider potentially as a mitigation option, that if certificate holders are working in a way that is focused on trying to increase the extent of FSC certification, would that be a valid consideration for a mitigation option? And in that sense, potentially, Michelle, it could be a little bit more measurable in terms of effectiveness. I don't know, but that was a thought and an idea that came up in a conversation that I was having with a colleague within the last couple of weeks. So I hear you, and I certainly think that we will be all looking at, as you know, with these controlled wood regional meetings, are there things that we can do that maintains feasibility while improving effectiveness based on what we know now, or do we not know enough and we need to have a little bit more time pass before making those kinds of decisions?
Great. Thanks, Amy. My sense is maybe we nudge here just to see if there's any open queries, Q&A on the overarching process at this point, pushing beyond just the polling queries, see where we stand for a moment. If there's anything, this is the Ask Amy session, wide open now, right? If we weren't already, right? Is there anything else that you want a quick answer to here, open Q&A? We can take a few minutes here and then move to sort of giving you a better sense of what to expect in these regional meetings. We'll do that as a last piece, and if we finish a couple of minutes early, no problem there given the 2-hour effort, but really appreciate everyone's engagement. Anything else you want to hear from Amy right now? It's under the sun that she could help you clarify relative to this stakeholder engagement effort. Just want to see if anything else shows up. There's been a lot of queries in the chat box. Very helpful. Okay, here we go. Just a couple here. Bertrand, proper implementation of the education mitigation option of the controlled wood standard does bring more knowledge of FSC principles to non-certified suppliers.
Okay.
What do you think, Amy?
I think it's great to hear that that's the experience that Bertrand has had, and I think that that's a really positive outcome from the work thus far.
What do you want, Amy, in terms of practitioners like Dan to bring to the meetings next month? What a softball, terrific query, Dan. Thank you so much. What could Dan do? Make those conversations as meaningful and helpful as possible.
I think, Dan, you've worked with a number of different certificate holders. You've got some knowledge and experience of some of the different approaches. Hopefully, I think potentially is different ways, and some of the we have flexibility within the system, and being able to reflect on where has that been positive, where has that not been necessary. Being able to also bring the stories, if you have any certificate holders who have worked directly with a particular conservation organization on one of those conservation initiatives, and better understanding how that's been working. We have some responses to the survey work that we did with certificate holders, but being able to bring kind of the pros and the cons of your experience in terms of working with certificate holders to implement these mitigation options, I think that would be helpful. I think that you're going to be in the part, yes, that's exactly what I was about to say. Yes, you're going to be partially the voice of feasibility. And yes, that's it entirely. If you have reflections and specifics that you can bring in terms of effectiveness, if there's anything that you've seen or done that you can point to in terms of, how you view and how you formed your opinion for those polls about effectiveness, what were you basing it on? That could be extremely helpful to FSCUS in terms of thinking about our monitoring and evaluation, and if there's additional data and information sources that we can bring into it.
Great. Anything else as we move to some final top lines and reminders for what's coming?
Yeah, I wonder if we have the time, Merrick, there were a couple of Q&A in the website itself. I'm not remembering exactly or specifically what those were, but we could
You want me
revisit
to cut
those.
back to the website for a moment?
Yeah, we could do that really briefly.
Okay, let me just put this down for a second. See if I can. One moment. I actually may have to. Can you just give me the website, Samanish, in the chat real quick again, please? I think you might have it above, but
Yep.
Yeah, so I know that one of the questions was whether participation in the webinar today would be considered, the participation in the controlled wood regional meetings, which is part of the control measures in the national risk assessment. The answer is no. That control measure is specific to the in-person controlled wood regional meetings. Today, as we've said, is helping us to prioritize certain aspects of what need to be addressed, help us provide the most effective framework and structure possible for those in-person meetings. But as indicated in the control measures themselves, it's either participating in or or having a representative at the controlled wood regional meeting, the in-person meeting, or being aware of the outcomes and outputs from those meetings. So no, participation in the webinar today does not cover that part of the control measure in the national risk assessment. So that was one of the questions. And if you can't find it, Eric, it's fine.
it's all right. Just not linking in as quickly as I wanted to, but I can get it figured out here. One
Amy,
second.
there is a question in the Q&A.
Okay.
Someone asked, should we have received a confirmation after registering for the meetings?
So it is, the registration is not set up to do an automatic confirmation. That's a really good point. Thank you. But as we move into next week and we are doing more work on the logistics and the specifics, Merrick and Samanish and I will be working on agenda and for the agendas for those meetings, but I can add that to the to-do list. That I think you're right, that would be a very valuable thing to do, is just remind folks who have registered, yes, you are registered, you don't need to do it again. And we will make sure that that confirmation does happen.
Great. Amy, you should be able to see these other questions off of the website here if you want to flag any of the answers quickly.
So I hit the second one. The first one, is it required if you're only sourcing from low? I mean, this is the same as what we had in 2018. If you're sourcing from only low risk areas, then you don't have to implement control measures. And so the regional meetings, well, we'd love to have your input, are certainly not required in any way. And if you are sourcing from a specified risk area, again, it's those three options: to participate yourself, send a representative, or be aware of the outcomes from the meetings. Will the controlled wood regional meeting reports be revised following the regional meetings? Ultimately, yes. Again, because those reports are seen as a normative element of the controlled wood system in the US, the timeline for the revision will depend on our engagement, FSC US's engagement with FSC International after the regional meetings, and we have a better sense of what are the kind of the extent or how much change might be needed at this point, or be potentially valuable at this point. Is there a cost for attending the meetings? No. We are not asking for any kind of registration fee. You would be responsible for getting yourself there. We'll be providing coffee and a lunch, so you don't need to worry about those. And yes, the webinar is being recorded. I'm not sure that we reminded folks of that at the beginning.
Right.
But we will be making the recording available through the website after sometime next week. I think it'll probably get posted.
Great.
Yep.
And an additional question from Shane here. Now that you've covered all of these, it's a bit of a long one, so I won't read it back to you, but you can see it at 145 about ASI, completing the compliance audits implications.
Okay. And concerns related to audits. So ASI is Assurance Services International, and they are the auditor of the auditors, is kind of a one way of looking at it, and they ensure that certification bodies are doing the audit work in a consistent and effective manner that's aligned with the standards and policies that regulate the auditing process. There have been some concerns brought forward. It's particularly related to the wording of the advice note, which is the place where this element of FSC US doing the monitoring and evaluation of the effectiveness of mitigation, as opposed to individual certificate holders doing that. There's been some question around the wording of the advice note. We are engaged with FSC International. Our conversations have indicated that there is a need to potentially revise the language of that advice note. Generally, FSC International is looking forward to the revision of the controlled wood standard and hoping that future revisions of that standard will make it so an advice note is not necessary. That is kind of the future of where we're going, and we're going to have to make sure that the US and stakeholders from the US are really engaged in that revision process for the controlled wood standard, to ensure that whatever comes out the other end is feasible and does work for US certificate holders. So I think that there's a path forward, and we are engaged with FSC International and ensuring that we have a future and a stability to move forward. Okay.
Great.
Hopefully that helped.
Great. And from William here, knowing a bit more about conservation initiatives, successful ones, how about more about the CMs that replace the mandatory ones? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, honestly, I have not heard of. So just for context, for those of you perhaps who are not as familiar with the individual clauses of the controlled wood standard, there is an opportunity for a certificate holder to develop their own control measure. They need to demonstrate that it's going to be, I think it was more effective than the mandatory ones in the standard. And I think this question is, have any certificate holders actually gone that route and developed their own control measures? I am not offhand aware of any. I would need to go back to, I don't remember Justin highlighting any certificate holder as having done that in terms of the feedback that we got through the survey that we did of certificate holders. So I'm not aware of any, but that's certainly something that I can dig into and look into again, just to make sure I'm not kind of missing something in my brain.
Great. And I'm not going to read these out loud, Jenna, don't worry, but the request for the kinds of lines of query and information that would be helpful at regional meets. Similarly from Steve, and a request for a specific topic in the Atlanta regional meeting. So I won't read those out. People can see those here, and I think that is excellent from both of you in terms of the kinds of things that you will find particularly valuable and contributing to a more enriching and helpful conversation. All right. I think we have enough of these pieces so far. This has been terrific. I think we should just quickly take on this last piece, the regional meets themselves. One more quick description, and then we can move to close. So let me just put this back up for a moment. Let's see, get rid of this and this. All right, you should be able to see the deck up there.
Yes.
All right, so just the reminders. You've seen the slide that's coming, I think, once ahead, but just to make sure that like this curious fox, right, you can find your way to the right conversation and talk about the right things that are useful to you in this space. So we have these 3 regional meets: Portland, Oregon, Asheville, North Carolina, in the Atlanta region. Each of the conversations is roughly 6 hours, 10 to 4 in its local time. Again, we'll warm you up proper with coffee and tea, and then a lunch, hot lunch in between for, I assume, 45 minutes or so, to make the most use of your time. And those conversations will be facilitated by myself along with Amy. So they will be a very explicit structure. It's not just a show up and chat. It is actually deeply informed by today's webinar and the themes that you've brought forward. We want to make sure it is maximum relevance and utility for you if you're able to attend in person. Now, someone asked earlier, what if we can't? Can we participate remotely? Even for the plenary sessions, knowing that the breakout conversations, what that means is the smaller groups that we'll probably have on thematic issues, is there any way that we could share the larger plenary conversations? So far, for those that have brought that up, it didn't feel feasible to have a hybrid, as we would call this, hybrid conversation. Given the other means, the website, this webinar, and so on, and the personal outreach to Amy, and she's offered her email on the website as well to answer queries and responses, we felt like the complication of trying to manage an online community with in-person was not going to be feasible. Yes, there are technologies like the OWL and so on that picks up, a group conversation, but it's quite complicated to integrate. We are not at this moment planning to have sort of a parts of the agenda where anybody can join at any time. However, if we hear more feedback that most people can't come for whatever reason, then we will of course try and figure out something. But for the moment, our experience facilitating in the pre and post pandemic context is that we really need to separate these kinds of meetings where we can and use an in-person dynamic to drive the conversation deeper and more effectively without the remote component. We'll take it into consideration if we hear more feedback. All right. So there's a couple pieces here as people are flagging about dates on the chat and so on. Your job, should you be able to attend, is to go to the web page, the homepage, and to register as soon as you can, so we have a sense of what our numbers are and so on. I believe, Amy, please clarify when that registration closes so that we can get our logistics in order. Is it roughly a day or two before the event? Can you clarify?
Yeah, so for the Tuesday meetings, and that would be Portland and Asheville, those are each Tuesday meetings. The registration closes the Thursday prior. So this is so we can give the caterer a final count on Friday.
Yeah.
And then for the Atlanta meeting, and I just want to say this verbally so that it's part of the recording. We recognize it on screen. The date for the Atlanta meeting should be December 14, not December 4. That meeting is a Wednesday, and the registration for similar reasons will close on Friday, the Friday prior, so that we can give the caterer a count on the Monday before that Wednesday meeting.
Great. So the website has all that accurate information. Bertrand, hear you in the chat about the request for a remote opportunity. We'll take that into consideration. Okay, thank you so much for that. Are there any additional questions about the nature or logistics of these upcoming regional meets? Just want to take our last couple minutes here if there is a question that you'd like to get a quick answer to. And we'll correct the information here on the deck going forward on dates. Right. All right, terrific. Well, I think there's no reason to belabor. I think we've covered a lot of waterfront, so to speak, or forest territory for that matter. So Amy, let me just turn it back to you. Thank you all for engaging us. What a terrific turnout, a very useful set of conversations with you all. Thank you for participating so meaningfully in the chat. And of course, it does not substitute for in-person discussion, right? These webinars, and yet they can help us accelerate the conversations we most need to have when we see you. So thank you so much for that. Amy, a final close?
Yeah, I just would like to thank everyone for being here again. Mirroring what you just said, Merrick, all of the engagement, the participation, the comments have been really helpful. The responses to the polls, really helpful. I am looking forward to seeing you all in person and learning a little bit more and digging into this a little bit more in terms of what opportunity we have in front of us, given the information that is available in terms of working on improving the priority being the mitigation options, looking again at the shared criteria. Do those need to change? Do the mitigation options themselves need to change in terms of effectiveness and feasibility, but also considering the inputs that could be helpful, looking forward to revision of the national risk assessment itself. I would like to clarify that next week, we will be again I'd like to clarify that we'll be posting the recording of this webinar on the website. And also we will be working on providing, particularly for questions that did not get answered today, making sure that the question and answer section of the website includes these questions and answers for those that were able to provide a clear and succinct and short answer to those. I would also like to take this opportunity. I think I saw a quick note from Sarah regarding the revision of the NRA framework. I want to highlight that right now, that is an open consultation, public consultation from FSC International. I would encourage all of you to take a look at that and participate in that revision process. So again, that's the NRA framework. It's the procedure that defines how we look at and consider risk and specified risk areas as part of a national risk assessment. So I encourage you, it's open until December 15th. So go and take a look at that. But generally, I just want to loop back around to how much I really appreciate the participation and the input and the engagement on this. It certainly is what has, from the beginning of this kind of alternative controlled wood approach, made it possible. So I thank you all for that, and look forward to continuing the process. So, thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you soon. Cheers.